Night presses down on the Anzio beachhead like a lid. Cold salt air drifts inland from the Tyrrhenian Sea, slipping through canvas seams and sandbag gaps. A field hospital tent breathes with the rhythm of work. Quiet footsteps, the clink of metal instruments, the soft tear of gauze. Lantern light is kept low, not for comfort, but for survival. Outside, artillery speaks in heavy syllables. The ground answers with tremors that ripple through cot legs and surgical tables. Mud clings to boots. Smoke clings to uniforms. Men arrive in waves, some carried, some stumbling, some already too still, faces pale under a film of dust and sweat. Inside, army nurses move without pause, sleeves rolled, hands steady. They cut fabric, clean wounds, count pulses, mark tags, triage in a world where seconds are spent like ammunition. And when the next impact hits close enough to rattle bottles and make the tent ropes sing, nobody runs. Because on this strip of contested coast, even the place meant for healing is within range. And the story of how Anzio was created begins long before the first stretcher crossed the threshold. By the winter of 1943, the war in Italy had slowed into something grim and mathematical. The Allies had landed on the mainland in September, and every mile north had been paid for in fuel, shells, and men. Germany's defense in depth, anchored by strong terrain and disciplined counterattacks, kept pushing the battle into the mountains and river valleys south of Rome. The Gustav Line became the name soldiers whispered like a wall. It was not a single trench, but a system. Positions tied to roads, ridge lines, and choke points that punished any army trying to force its way through. So the Allies looked for another way to break the geometry. The idea was simple enough to say out loud and difficult enough to risk an army. Land behind the line. A sudden amphibious thrust on the western coast of Italy, near the towns of Anzio and Nettuno, could turn the German flank, threaten the highways to Rome, and pull German forces away from the stalemate. The operation received a clean code name, Operation Shingle, and behind the neat label lay a plan full of pressure and uncertainty. Even in official histories, one problem is underlined. The objective was not always clear in practice. Some plans envisioned a rapid drive inland toward key high ground in the Alban Hills. Others feared moving too far, too soon, into a trap. On 22nd of January 1944, Allied troops came ashore. At first, it looked like the kind of landing commanders dream about, less resistance than expected, a port captured, roads seized, units pushing a few miles inland before the enemy could fully react. Numbers climbed quickly in the first hours. Men, vehicles, supplies, everything that turns sand into a foothold. But a beachhead is not a victory. It is a promise that must be kept. German commanders were surprised by the location, not by the possibility. They had prepared contingencies, and within hours the response began. Mobile battle groups moved to block roads and buy time. Reinforcements were called in. Artillery was positioned where it could look down into the flat coastal plain. The beachhead tightened into a perimeter that could be held, but was also easy to range. On maps, it appeared as a small bulge of Allied color. On the ground, it felt like a bowl. The enemy could throw steel into it from multiple directions, day after day, and that is how the medical crisis forms. Because every stalled advance, every probing attack, every bombardment, each one produces casualties that do not pause simply because the front line does. The wounded begin their own journey, a chain that starts in the dirt and ends, if the chain holds, under canvas and electric light. Aid men and medics do the first work where bullets are still close. Tourniquets, morphine, pressure dressings, a whispered instruction to keep breathing. Then the wounded are passed back to aid stations and collecting points. From there to clearing stations and onward, when roads exist and ambulances can move, to evacuation hospitals, the places designed to hold operating rooms, wards, and the personnel to keep them running for weeks and months at a time. On a normal front, those hospitals sit at a safer distance. At Anzio, safety becomes a sliding scale. The beachhead is narrow. Space is limited. The enemy's guns and aircraft do not respect the idea of a rear area. Medical sites are marked, organized, and protected as much as possible. But the reality of combat doesn't always follow the rules soldiers learn in manuals. Hospitals near Anzio were subjected to shelling and air attack, and medical staff became casualties too. Proof, in flesh, that healing had been dragged into the same danger as fighting. This is where the nurses enter the story, not as background figures, but as part of the beachhead's endurance. They are trained to bring order to a flood, to watch a face and know shock is coming, to measure blood loss with a glance at bandages, to keep hands steady when the ground shakes. Their work is not heroic because it is dramatic. It is heroic because it is repetitive, exacting, and done while fear tries to climb up the spine like cold water. And the wounded keep coming. Americans, Britons, and others fighting under the Allied umbrella, men who thought the worst part would be the beach, only to learn the worst part can be the waiting. But a battlefront like Anzio doesn't only deliver the wounded from your own side. Because once the beachhead locks into place, and raids and counterattacks begin to trade ground by the yard, another kind of stretcher appears in the same corridor. The enemies. War teaches men to draw lines. Uniforms define who you protect and who you shoot. Flags tell you where you belong. Language divides one fear from another. On the battlefield, those lines feel absolute. But inside a field hospital, they begin to blur, not because the war is forgotten, but because the body obeys different rules. At Anzio, those rules arrive on stretchers. German soldiers, and others fighting under Axis command, are carried in with the same injuries as the men who fired on them hours earlier. Shrapnel does not recognize ideology. Blood loss ignores language. Shock makes the same demands of every human system. When enemy wounded are captured or surrender, they enter a process governed by law, doctrine, and discipline, not emotion. Under the Geneva Convention, wounded prisoners of war are to be treated humanely and receive medical care equivalent to that given to one's own troops. For the U.S. Army Medical Department, this is not an abstract principle. It is a standing order. In practice, that means the same triage tags, the same surgical tables, the same plasma bottles hanging from improvised hooks. Care is prioritized by urgency, not by uniform color. A man bleeding out is treated before a man who can wait, whether he speaks English or German. For many Axis soldiers, this is not what they expect. Years of propaganda have done their work. The enemy is described as brutal, vengeful, eager to repay suffering with suffering. Surrender is painted as weakness at best, annihilation at worst. Some wounded men arrive tense, silent, watching every movement with suspicion. Others arrive already defeated, expecting neglect or rough handling. Instead, they are met by a system that does not pause to argue with them. The nurses do not debate ideology. They check airways. They clean wounds. They administer pain relief. They record vitals. Their authority comes not from shouting orders, but from competence. In the ward, a nurse's voice becomes a constant, calm, measured, impossible to ignore. Even enemy wounded begin to notice something unsettling. The people tending them are not cruel, and they are not afraid. This professionalism is not accidental. By 1944, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps has been at war long enough to be hardened by experience. North Africa, Sicily, Salerno. Each campaign has carried lessons forward about infection, about evacuation speed, about what exhaustion does to staff as much as patience. Nurses are officers. They answer to military discipline. They are trained to maintain standards even when emotions try to interfere. Compassion is present, but it is structured. No favoritism, no exceptions. The work must continue. For the wounded enemy soldier lying on a cot, this can be more disturbing than cruelty. Cruelty would confirm what he was told. Order does not. He watches nurses work through air raid alarms. He watches them return to bedsides after explosions. He watches them speak to guards and doctors with the same tone they use with everyone else. And slowly, an understanding settles in. This place runs on rules that do not bend for hatred. The nurses are not naive about who these men are. They know what uniforms they wore. They know what battles are still being fought only miles away. But their role is not to judge outcomes. It is to preserve life where possible. In the calculus of war, this is not weakness. It is doctrine reinforced by law and experience. Treating wounded prisoners properly reduces chaos, supports intelligence gathering, and maintains moral authority. Values that commanders understand even when the fighting grows bitter. But doctrine does not protect against shells. As German artillery finds the range and aircraft probe the perimeter, the beachhead becomes a place where the front line and the hospital line overlap. Tents are reinforced with sandbags. Operating schedules adjust to bombardments. Nurses sleep in snatches, boots close by. And in this tightening ring of danger, enemy wounded begin to realize something else. If the firing gets worse, they cannot run. They are prisoners. They are injured. Their lives depend on the people they were taught to fear. And that is when the question starts to surface. Not shouted, not dramatic, but urgent all the same. Will these nurses stay when the bombs come down? The answer waits in the angles of the story: human, tactical, technological, and moral, each one revealing a different pressure bearing down on the same small stretch of canvas and light. Fatigue does not announce itself with a single collapse. It accumulates quietly, stacking hours on top of each other until judgment blurs and hands begin to tremble. At Anzio, Army nurses work shifts that stretch far beyond what peacetime medicine would tolerate. Casualty surges do not respect schedules. A lull can end without warning, and the next wave arrives already bleeding time. Sleep comes in fragments. Boots stay within reach. Helmets are sometimes kept near beds, not because regulations demand it, but because experience does. Nurses learn to rest without fully disconnecting, a skill that becomes essential when artillery wakes the ground in the early hours. Emotion has to be managed as carefully as supplies. There is no room for visible panic. The wounded take their cues from the staff around them. A calm voice can lower heart rates. A steady presence can keep shock from turning fatal. Nurses learn to compartmentalize fear, placing it somewhere they will deal with later, if later ever comes. At Anzio, that discipline is tested daily. Medical staff know the statistics. They know hospitals are marked, but they also know marks do not stop high explosive shells. When medical personnel are wounded or killed, the loss cuts deeper than numbers suggest. Every trained nurse represents experience that cannot be replaced quickly. Each absence stretches those who remain, yet the work continues. Because stopping is not an option when men are still arriving on stretchers. And because the presence of nurses under fire becomes its own form of reassurance to soldiers, to doctors, and even to prisoners watching from their cots. The nurses are not immune to fear. They are practiced at not letting it decide their actions. In this environment, breaking does not look like screaming or running. Breaking would look like leaving a patient unattended. And that line, at Anzio, is not crossed. Battlefield medicine at Anzio is not a single heroic act. It is a chain. Each link matters. If one breaks, survival rates fall sharply. The speed with which a wounded soldier moves from point of injury to surgical care often determines whether he lives or dies. At Anzio, maintaining that chain is a constant struggle against geography and enemy pressure. The beachhead is cramped. Roads are few. Mud turns routes into traps for vehicles. Ambulances compete with artillery units, supply convoys, and troop movements for space. Shelling interrupts traffic without warning. A single damaged road can ripple delays backward through the entire system. Evacuation hospitals are designed to be mobile, but mobility has limits when enemy guns can reach nearly every position. Sites are chosen for access and concealment, not safety. Tents are camouflaged. Lights are shielded. Surgical schedules adapt to bombardment patterns, with teams ready to pause and resume work as conditions allow. In this context, nurses become part of the tactical framework. Their efficiency keeps beds cycling. Their triage decisions shape outcomes. Their ability to stabilize patients under pressure prevents bottlenecks further down the line. The hospital is not just a place of recovery, it is an operational node. When it functions, units can keep fighting. When it falters, the front feels it. Even enemy wounded are part of this calculus. Treating prisoners quickly reduces guard requirements, prevents disease spread, and maintains order within the facility. It also sends a message, intentional or not, that the system is confident enough to extend care beyond its own ranks. But confidence is easier to maintain on paper than under shell fire. For many Axis soldiers brought into Anzio's hospitals, the shock is immediate. They expect hostility. They find procedure. They expect neglect. They receive treatment. Their wounds are handled with the same clinical focus given to Allied soldiers beside them. The difference is not subtle. It is disorienting. Some remain guarded, watching every movement. Others relax despite themselves. Pain relief and clean bandages doing what ideology cannot. Guards remain present. Orders are enforced. But cruelty does not materialize. As days pass, a pattern emerges. When artillery sounds closer, Allied wounded grow tense, but they trust the routines. Enemy wounded, lacking that institutional trust, begin to watch the nurses instead. They measure reactions. Do the nurses flinch? Do they run? Do they abandon their posts? Each time the nurses return after a near miss, something shifts. The fear that dominated surrender gives way to a different anxiety, not about being harmed, but about being left behind if the hospital must move or evacuate. Dependency replaces defiance. The enemy wounded understand a simple truth. Their survival is now tied to the endurance of people they were taught to hate. And endurance, at Anzio, is about to be tested in ways that no doctrine can fully prepare for. In 1944, medicine is not yet modern, but it is no longer helpless. The difference matters on a beachhead like Anzio. Wounds that would have meant death in 1918 can sometimes be treated if the right supplies arrive, if evacuation is fast enough, if infection can be held back. Field hospitals rely on a set of tools that look simple and feel miraculous in the dark. Plasma and whole blood, when available, become lifelines against shock. Sulfonamide drugs, used earlier in the war, still play a role against infection. Penicillin is emerging as a transformative antibiotic, but it is not a limitless wonder. Supplies are finite, distribution uneven, and its use is controlled. Still, for men opened by shrapnel and stitched back together under canvas, even limited antibiotic capability changes the odds. Technique becomes as important as technology. Sterility is pursued in a place that cannot be sterile. Instruments are cleaned and reused. Surfaces are wiped and rewiped. Hands are scrubbed until skin roughens. Nurses become guardians of process, checking dressings, monitoring fevers, catching the first signs that a wound is turning. A single infection can undo a surgeon's work. Triage is the hardest technique of all. Not everyone can be saved. Not everyone can be treated first. Triage tags reduce human lives to categories, but the purpose is survival at scale. Nurses and doctors focus on what can be stabilized quickly, what requires immediate surgery, what can wait, and what, brutal as it is, may be beyond help with the resources on hand. And when enemy wounded arrive, triage does not change. The same categories, the same procedures, the same relentless arithmetic of time. That consistency is part of what unsettles Axis soldiers. They are not being favored, but they are also not being discarded. They are being processed through a machine built to preserve life as efficiently as possible. At Anzio, the machine runs in mud and noise, and still it runs. Hospitals in war do not operate on goodwill. They operate on command. Evacuation hospitals are military units. They have commanders, schedules, protocols, guard details, and logistics problems that never end. Nurses are officers, and enlisted staff are trained to follow orders under pressure. This matters when shells are falling. Fear is contagious, but so is discipline. Leadership shows in small things. Sandbags placed correctly, tents oriented for drainage, blackout procedures enforced at night, records kept even when it seems pointless, because records ensure continuity of care, staff rotations managed so no one collapses at the worst possible moment. And leadership shows in the hardest rule of all: the work continues. When bombardments intensify, medical staff may be moved to cover, briefly, but the expectation is clear. Return to patients, stabilize the situation, keep treatment going. This is not romantic courage. It is institutional necessity. A hospital that stops functioning becomes a death sentence for those already wounded. This is also where the breaking idea truly lives. A nurse's breaking point is not a dramatic moment for history books. It is the moment routine fails, when fear overrides training and a patient is left untreated. Every system around her is designed to prevent that moment. Shared procedures, supervision, teamwork, and the hard-earned confidence that comes from doing the job in terrible conditions and discovering you can still do it. Even prisoners sense this chain of authority. They see that nurses do not take orders from them and do not bend to them. They see that treatment is consistent, not negotiable. Some Axis wounded interpret this as coldness at first, until they realize coldness is not what they are receiving. They are receiving neutrality, structured compassion enforced by discipline. But discipline meets its harshest test when the enemy decides the hospital itself is fair game, or when shells and bombs make no distinction between the front and the wards. Because at Anzio, the turning point does not come with a grand speech. It comes with the sound of aircraft, the sudden whine of falling bombs, and the earth heaving so hard that even the calmest hands have to fight to stay steady. The Anzio beachhead never truly sleeps. Even when the firing drops to a distant rumble, the air carries the warning of what can return at any moment. Engines, shells, the sudden crack of bombs that turn a quiet night into a screaming one. Outside the tents, the perimeter holds because men with rifles hold it. Inside the tents, the perimeter holds because someone keeps the wounded alive long enough to be moved, treated, and returned, or at least carried away with dignity. Operation Shingle was designed to shock the German line from behind. On paper, it was an amphibious strike meant to loosen the grip of the Gustav Line and open the road toward Rome. In reality, it created a compressed battlefield, tens of thousands of men forced into a narrow space under the reach of German artillery and air attack. And so the hospitals sit there too, inside the same bowl. Canvas wards, sandbagged edges, vehicles parked in tight rows, supply stacks covered with tarps, red crosses that announce intent but cannot guarantee protection. The staff learns the sound of incoming fire the way infantry learns it, the difference between distant thunder and danger that's already falling. Then comes 7th February 1944. It is not a day that begins with a dramatic warning. It begins like the others. Work, stretchers, bandages, a steady flow of men whose lives are measured in minutes. And then the sky delivers violence that is not aimed at a trench line, but at the place meant to catch the consequences. A German aircraft. Sources describe the episode as a German plane jettisoning bombs, drops fragmentation bombs over the area of the 95th Evacuation Hospital at the Anzio beachhead. The result is catastrophic. The hospital is struck and left non-functional, with significant casualties among patients and staff. Contemporary records and institutional summaries describe 28 killed and around 60 wounded in the attack. For the people inside the tents, the numbers are not abstract. They are bodies on the ground where bodies are never supposed to be. They are blood where clean instruments were laid out. They are the sudden, disorienting reversal. Healers becoming casualties, and the hospital becoming a target zone. The bomb damage is not just physical, it breaks the rhythm. Operating capacity collapses. Workspaces are torn apart. The wounded, who were meant to be treated now, must be moved, stabilized elsewhere, triaged again. A hospital is a system. When you fracture it, every small delay becomes lethal for someone who cannot afford time. And still, instinct fights with training. Every human impulse says to run, to find shelter, to get away from the canvas and the lights that draw attention. But the discipline of wartime medicine says something else. If you move, do it with purpose. If you stop, stop to save a life. This is where the nurse's story tightens like a knot. In a war film, courage is often shown with a weapon. Here, courage looks like staying close to the wounded when everything in your body wants distance. It looks like keeping track of supplies while explosions threaten to scatter them. It looks like using your voice, not loud, not theatrical, but steady, so that injured men don't slip into panic and shock. The 95th Evacuation Hospital's ordeal at Anzio is remembered precisely because it demonstrates how thin the line is between rear and front in modern war. The hospital, established to absorb casualties, suddenly becomes a casualty event itself, one so severe it becomes a matter of record and later historical attention, including preserved after-action reporting and photographic documentation of the bombing's aftermath. And the beachhead does not pause out of respect. Even as the hospital is hit, the perimeter still needs holding. The guns still fire. Men are still wounded. The medical chain must reroute, adapt, and continue. Because stopping doesn't just surrender ground, it surrenders lives. Somewhere among those lives are prisoners of war. Because Anzio is not just Allied wounded pouring back from the line. It is also Axis wounded, captured, surrendered, or picked up after failed assaults, pulled into the same battered medical system. Their uniforms mark them as enemies, but their injuries mark them as urgent. And now, on a day when even the hospital is bleeding, they are forced to watch the same question tighten in the air. If the bombs fall again, will the nurses leave? The answer is not spoken as a speech. It is revealed in what happens next. In the same cramped spaces, under the same falling steel, as enemies and allies begin sharing the same oxygen and the same fear. After the strike, The beachhead feels even smaller. Smoke hangs low, mixing with the wet smell of churned earth and antiseptic. Canvas is ripped and patched. Equipment is redistributed. Wards are reorganized wherever space can be made. If a hospital becomes unusable, patients are shifted to other facilities in the medical network because the chain must keep moving, even if one link has been shattered. But the wounded do not move like supplies. They move slowly, carefully, with pain that turns every bump into a spike. Some are stable, some are not. Some are drifting on the edge of consciousness, held there by plasma, morphine, and the relentless attention of staff who refuse to let them slip. This is where the moment changes tone. Not because the fighting stops, it doesn't, but because the meaning of the hospital shifts for everyone inside it. For Allied wounded, the hospital has always been part of the plan. Even if they fear bombardment, they know the system. They know that doctors and nurses will work through the night, that evacuation is possible, that there are procedures designed to keep them alive. For wounded Axis prisoners, this environment is still new. They arrived expecting something else. They expected rough handling, neglect, or at best indifference. Many have been conditioned to believe they are entering the hands of an enemy who will return suffering with interest. But what they are given instead, at Anzio, in the shadow of a shattered hospital, is clinical consistency. They are triaged, tagged, cleaned, treated. They see nurses with exhaustion etched into their faces, uniforms stained and wrinkled, hair pinned back under regulation caps or scarves, still moving from cot to cot like metronomes. They see the same hands that dress an American's burns dress theirs. The same voice that calms a British infantryman calm them. And then the bombardment comes again. Not necessarily another direct strike like February 7th, but the continuing reality of Anzio. Shells and air raids that keep testing nerves and structures. The beachhead is a place where danger is routine. Medical units operated under repeated threat, and staff understood they could be hit even when clearly serving a protected function. In those moments, fear expresses itself differently, depending on who has power. An infantryman can grab his gear and run for a slit trench if he must. A nurse can duck and return. A wounded prisoner cannot. He is confined by injury, by captivity, by the simple fact that his body will not cooperate. He is forced into a helplessness that soldiers are trained to avoid at any cost, and helplessness changes the questions a man asks in his own mind. It becomes less about politics, less about victory, less about pride, more about whether the people around him will abandon him. This is where the title's emotional hinge belongs, handled carefully without invented speeches. We don't need a Hollywood dialogue to reach the reality. Wounded prisoners, under bombardment, often fear being left behind. Their lives depend entirely on the functioning of an enemy system. Under fire, that dependence can surface as pleading, gestures, urgent questions through interpreters, or repeated anxious looks toward the staff. Silent requests that mean the same thing. Don't go. Don't leave us here. And the nurse's response, documented in pattern and practice, is not sentimental. It is procedural. It is steady. It is the most unsettling kind of mercy, because it is not performed for applause. Nurses remain at stations as long as they can. They return immediately when they must take cover. They keep charts updated. They maintain sanitation. They monitor shock. They restrain panic without force, by anchoring the room with routine. This is how evacuation hospitals survive sustained pressure, not by heroics, but by refusing to let chaos set the tempo. For an Axis wounded man watching all of this, something breaks. Not the nurse, but the expectation. He thought these women would crack. that fear or hatred would override duty, that in the instant of danger, his uniform would matter again. Instead, he watches them reach for bandages while shells fall. He watches them check a pulse while alarms sound. He watches them move to the next cot and the next, as if the only way through terror is to outwork it. And if he pleads, if he begs them not to leave, it is not because he suddenly loves the enemy. It is because he recognizes, with the clarity that comes when mortality is close, that these nurses are the difference between dying alone and living long enough to see another day. In a war that measures men by the ground they take, this is a different kind of turning point. It's not a hill seized or a line broken. It's a realization, shared quietly across the space between enemies, that discipline can look like mercy, and mercy can be as unyielding as steel. By morning, the wounded are still there. Some have been moved. Some have been operated on. Some have not made it. The staff is still exhausted. The beachhead is still under threat. But inside the ward, something has shifted in the atmosphere. The enemy wounded no longer look at the nurses as monsters. They look at them as the last stable thing in a world that keeps shaking. And that change, small, human, almost private, will ripple into what comes next. The consequences, the losses, the memory, and the uncomfortable truth that even in total war, the rules of humanity can survive in the hands of people who refuse to let them die. In the days after the hospital area at Anzio was hit, the most important word in the medical chain became continuity. A field hospital can lose tents, instruments, even personnel, and still be expected to function because the front does not stop. Producing casualties. The attack on the 95th Evacuation Hospital on 7 February 1944 was severe enough to render it inoperable, killing and wounding staff and patients, including nurses. But even a unit knocked out does not end the work. Patients are redistributed. Other hospitals absorb the overflow. Supply routes are adjusted. The medical system, like a combat unit, is forced to improvise under pressure. That improvisation costs something you can't log on a form. It costs nerves. It costs sleep. It costs the last thin layer of emotional reserve that staff were already rationing. At Anzio, evacuation hospitals were operating closer to the front than doctrine preferred, because the beachhead's geography didn't offer many safer options, and the lines were close enough that artillery and air attacks could reach hospital areas. So the aftermath is not just what happened, but what it did. It hardens routines into armor. Sandbags get stacked higher. Blackout discipline becomes stricter. Movement between tents becomes faster and more deliberate. Everyone learns the difference between a distant concussion and one that means you should already be on the ground. Wards reorganize around survivability, where to place the most critical patients, how to move stretchers if the tent line collapses, how to keep sterilization going when dust and smoke keep returning. And through all of it, the nurses become a kind of visible proof that the beachhead still holds. Not the beachhead on the map, the one inside men's minds. The wounded see nurses working under threat and interpret it as a message: you have not been abandoned. That matters because shock is not only physical, it's psychological. Panic elevates heart rates, worsens bleeding, accelerates collapse. Calm lowers the temperature of the room. That calm is contagious. It spreads from nurse to patient, from one cot to the next. It even crosses the line that war usually keeps rigid, because wounded prisoners are watching too. They see that bombardment doesn't change the rules inside the tent. They see that care continues because the unit's purpose is non-negotiable, enforced by training and command. There's a practical consequence here as well, one commanders understood even if they never said it aloud. Hospitals that continue functioning mean units can continue fighting. The Anzio battle became a prolonged ordeal, months of attrition in a tight perimeter, where endurance was as decisive as maneuver. In that kind of battle, medical services are not support, they are structural. They keep manpower from draining away faster than replacements can arrive. They preserve morale by preserving lives. And then there's the other consequence, the one that doesn't fit neatly in an after-action report. When Axis wounded and prisoners experience consistent, humane treatment, it destabilizes the story they were fed about what capture means. International law required humane treatment and protections for prisoners of war, and the medical care of the wounded was part of that larger framework. In the short term, it reduces chaos inside the hospital compound. Fewer desperate acts, fewer confrontations, fewer men convinced they must die rather than be taken. But in the immediate aftermath at Anzio, nobody is thinking about propaganda effects. They are thinking about the next stretcher, the next hemorrhage, the next wave of mud-caked uniforms at the tent flap. Because the beachhead doesn't reward emotion, it rewards sustained function. And sustained function, after bombs hit the hospital itself, depends on a simple, relentless decision repeated hundreds of times a day. Stay, work, treat, move to the next bed. And once the wounded stabilize, once the air clears and the shock settles, the story starts to shift from immediate survival to what happens to memory, especially for prisoners who lived because the enemy refused to let them die. After the worst nights at Anzio, silence never arrives all at once. It comes in pieces. First the gap between shells, then a lull in aircraft engines, then the moment the lantern flame stops shaking. In those quiet stretches, the wounded become aware again of where they are, of what happened, of who kept them alive. For Allied soldiers, the memory often forms around faces. A nurse leaning in to check a pulse, a voice telling them to drink. Hands cutting away a blood-stiff sleeve with practiced speed. In veteran recollections and institutional histories, nurses are frequently described not as distant figures, but as anchors, calm presences in a place where men felt themselves slipping toward death. For wounded Axis prisoners, the memory can be sharper and more conflicted. They carry the shock of realizing the enemy treated them under the same triage logic and clinical care given to Allied wounded. That doesn't erase the war. It doesn't create friendship. But it complicates the narrative they were prepared to live with. That capture equals vengeance, and that compassion is impossible between opposing flags. Here the important thing is to stay honest about what can be said with certainty. We can't claim that every Axis prisoner begged in the same words. We can't place an invented plea in a man's mouth and call it history. But we can state a verifiable pattern. Prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment and medical care, and in Allied facilities this was enforced through doctrine and discipline. And we can say, plausibly and realistically, that wounded captives, immobile, frightened, and dependent, often feared abandonment under bombardment and sought reassurance through interpreters, guards, or urgent gestures when danger intensified. That fear is not romantic. It is human. A wounded prisoner has no control. His weapon is gone. His unit is gone. His world has collapsed to a cot, a bandage, the ache of damaged flesh. When shells fall nearby, the question he carries is not about strategy. It is about whether this place, run by the enemy, will still protect him when protecting him becomes risky. In the months and years after Anzio, those memories become part of the war's quiet record, not always written down in neat reports, sometimes held privately, sometimes told in fragments. But the effect is real. The war's moral landscape is shaped as much by how armies behave in their hospitals and prison cages as by how they behave in their offensives. For the nurses, the after is not a clean ending either. Their war does not end when a patient is discharged. It continues in the accumulation of scenes, the sound of incoming aircraft, the smell of burned canvas, the weight of a stretcher corner in the hands, the pressure of keeping a room calm when fear is trying to climb the walls. Some carry pride. Some carry grief. Many carry both, and because history often narrows its lens to generals and frontline assaults, the medical war can fade into the background, even though, without it, the battlefield story collapses. Anzio itself would grind on, a prolonged fight of attrition before the Allies finally broke out of the beachhead and advanced toward Rome. But the meaning of that winter at the coast isn't only in the ground taken. It's in the endurance of a medical unit that kept working after it was hit. It's in the discipline of nurses who refused to let chaos replace procedure. And it's in the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the clearest proof of strength in war is not what you do to the enemy, but what you refuse to do, even when you have the power. That truth leads naturally into the final quiet place this story needs to end. Not with applause, but with reflection. What this moment at Anzio meant for military medicine, for the laws of war, and for the human capacity to stay humane in a landscape designed to strip humanity away. War is designed to simplify the world. It divides humanity into sides, uniforms, targets. It trains people to reduce complexity to survival and obedience. In that narrowing of purpose, empathy becomes inefficient and sometimes dangerous. Yet, at Anzio, in the winter of 1944, something stubborn refused to disappear. A hospital under fire kept functioning, not because its staff were fearless, but because fear was never allowed to make decisions. The Army nurses at Anzio did not stand out because they defied orders or acted outside the system. They stood out because they embodied it, discipline, training, and professional mercy enforced even when the ground shook and the sky dropped steel. Their work mattered beyond the cots. Modern battlefield medicine, triage systems, rapid evacuation, standardized care proved that saving lives at scale was possible even under extreme pressure. And the laws of war, often dismissed as fragile ideals, were tested where they are hardest to maintain, not in victory parades, but in blood-soaked tents serving both friend and foe. For the wounded Axis soldiers who depended on American nurses to survive, the experience did not end the war or rewrite loyalties, but it fractured certainty. It showed that the enemy was not a monster by default, and that power could be exercised without cruelty. In war, that realization can be as destabilizing as defeat. For the nurses, the legacy is quieter. They did not capture ground or command divisions. They held a line that did not appear on maps, the line between order and collapse, between care and abandonment. When bombs fell on the hospital itself, they did not break. They returned. They treated the next patient. They kept the system alive. And that may be the most enduring lesson of Anzio, that even in total war, humanity does not survive by accident. It survives because ordinary people, trained to do difficult work, decide again and again to stay at their posts. Long after the guns fell silent on the Italian coast, that choice remained. Not carved into stone, not celebrated with medals, but carried forward in the lives that continued, because someone refused to leave when leaving would have been easier.